Hey, before I get started, I'd like to thank those that invited me here, the College of Forestry, student organizations, and I appreciate the invitation to be back up here, and it's good to come back and tie in with old professors and friends and other students. Also in line in the honor of what Bodie Shaw brought up yesterday was to recognize the Kalapuyan territory we're in and the remembrance of those ancestral people here, and that we try to carry forward, not only what was going on for thousands of years for what they were managing, but also to remember that in many other places, wherever we go, that there's a history of place, and there's much to learn from that, and there's different ways, especially as a scientist, that we try to look at those histories of place and human experience on the landscape. And many of you here have helped me kind of put this together and help me understand it and provide critical feedback and constructive criticism, and I thank you all in various ways that you've touched me and helped me through my career as a graduate student and now as a scientist. So what I'm going to give an overview today is some of the work that I have from Northwest California, focusing on the Karuk, and really I want to look at some of the methodologies revolving around the different scientific disciplines and what's the utility of some of those and how can they help infer and help us understand the extent of Aboriginal management on the landscape. So I'll be looking here at the Karuk territory. This is where I live, right here by the Salmon River mouth, the Orleans community. There's the Oregon-California border. This is the general territory I'm talking about. A lot of the stuff I'll be talking about is applicable throughout the Southwest Oregon, Northwest California region. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this paper, but this is one that kind of had me thinking a little bit more, and I always appreciate Kathy Whitlock's research and some of the other colleagues she works with. And often in that, and particularly this paper, I think was one of the first ones where they looked at the different methodologies of paleoclimate, fire histories, the scales in which those are applicable. And there was one element that, and often I try to think about, is where does TEK fit into this? And, we all have our statistical parts of things, and I was thinking, well, if there was an optimal mean of TEK as far as the diversity and scope of knowledge, where would that be? And so on the scale, if you can't see this, it goes from seconds, days, years, decades, centuries, millennia, and then over here is from micro, site, local, landscape, regional. So we have a kind of a spatial scale here and a temporal scale, and these are essentially the same themes of like the fire triangle or fire behavior triangle, and then she talks about these super fire regimes. And often it's these bigger climatic processes that work downward and influence it. And so I thought, well, when I looked at this and based on oral history interviews and working of elders and ethnographic stuff, where does TEK fall out on this? And so I think it's often from these days to kind of decades or even centuries. And as you get out here a little bit longer, well, there is some, a little bit of degeneration of the knowledge, how much people can remember the context of environmental change. But I think really here TEK is applicable at like the fire event where we understand weather, fuels, landscape and local controls. And then at this fire regime level, particularly as it ties to vegetation and some of these other climatic factors, understanding what goes on there. So I just wanted to kind of leave you with that idea and reference this paper and thinking about where we apply TEK for other studies. In regards to what I want to kind of cover is the debate of natural versus anthropogenic effects across ecological scales. A lot of these factors have to do with what influences the fire regimes? Is it the climate-weather interaction, particularly looking at lightning and vegetation, or how that responds, vegetation responds to those factors? And then looking at the biophysical things. We know based on a lot of the fire history studies that Carl Skinner, Alan Taylor, others have done, so that slope position is important. The aspect is another element. Substrate, especially down in the Klamath, between serpentine soils, that really influences fuel continuity, productivity, how those areas burn. And then with that, really the fuel loading are time since last fire by severity. And we're seeing now with some other fire research, as you look at the kind of interlocking jigsaw puzzle of former fires, and especially these larger fires, often it's burning into the former black. And some of the work by another PSW scientist, Collins, and others from the Sierra Nevada essentially showed that within kind of 10 years, if a fire burns into that former area of a 10-year burn, it kind of stops. But after 10 years, based on the fuel type or substrate and productivity, a fire can spread. And I'll talk a little bit about how that ties back to Aboriginal fire management and serial stage. And then another component is humans. And so if we think about land use practices and ignitions, especially tribal fire use practices, it's kind of hard to see here, but the green triangles are essentially all the villages along the river. The red lines, which I'll show in other maps, are the historical trails that I've been able to document. And then this is a map from 1910 to 2003, is a distribution of lightning and human ignitions for that Mid-Klamath River region. And it just is one way of me thinking about, what are these overlaying both climatic, weather, and human land use patterns for the specific geographic area. So when we think about some of the studies, and often what informs at the larger scale for our area is one of Kathy Whitlock's students, Bryles, looking at Bolin Lake and Sanger Lake. Essentially, these are some higher elevation ones, but this one's a little bit lower elevation lake here. And this generally what happens is, you look at charcoal and pollen. The scale is often millennial to centuries. It's can be often a regional or even a watershed level. And then if that's coupled with or linked in with fire history studies, we can begin to look at some of the seasonal parts of it, its frequency, and then that is a different scale. And I'll come back to touching on these, but just overall, a lot of the studies that have been done at higher elevations, and often a lot of the conclusions or data results interpret that as being more of a climatic signature, and it has to do a lot with vegetation assemblage change over time based on some of the pollen. What are some other evidence to consider? And I started looking at regional archaeological patterns and cross-referencing that with some of the climate data. And really when we get down to excavations, sites, they're looking at artifacts or remains. The scale in which they often look at and consider their data happens to be at centuries or decadal level for their kind of accuracy, their resolution. There's some other constraints or some things to think about as far as gradients like elevational or coastal versus interior. And then with that, you have the ethnographic information. And there's oral history information. You can also use photographs or sketches. That was addressed yesterday with Carloni's talk. And then, the scale of also information and what's applicable to the landscape when we think about the tribal level, the family, or at the person, how knowledge is passed down. And so here's a village site, kind of close to where I live. Here's very little archaeological information done for that area. But when I'm out there gathering acorns and huckleberries with my grandpa, I have a different way of looking and how he relates to the landscape from his grandfather's time or his grandmother's time. And often that sometimes is a much more refined scale to a particular place. And so how do I take that kind of local, very almost to this grove of trees or this berry patch, and think about that at a larger landscape or watershed context? And so to think about that, it's like, well, what can we think about data and the utility of it kind of at this stand or plot level? And is it observational data, or is it kind of manipulative experiments? We also have to consider, well, if we, based on the elder's testimony that, well, we burn hazel every year. Well, we know based on fuel loading and the fuel properties of a stand or the plot, that fuel continuity, you really can't burn it every year, but perhaps it's adjacent places that they were burning in a similar habitat. So we have to think about that. And so some of my other studies have tried to look at California hazel, looking at burn patterns. And essentially, you go from hazel sprouts, peel the sticks, and it goes into a basket that size. And so what's the utility of scaling up, not only at broad climate level studies, but all the way down to the plot level? And then there's other applications like GIS, where we're thinking about landscape to watershed, and also the stand level analysis for different variables of interest. And some of these, which I'll also get back into later in talk, looks at human mobility, foraging, and these travel routes. And Ken Carloni talked about that, and there's different methods. And I think that's one area that I'm interested in going for my research, just to strengthen the landscape connectivity between tribal land use practices. And then there's another element, and I'll show some research from some other place on this one, but in order to model human ignitions, if we think, well, if we use Farsight and we had the FVS stand visualization simulation for this area, and we modeled the frequency or seasonality of ignitions, would we come up with kind of what we see at the plot or the stand level? And so there's different ways in which we can incorporate that stand plot level data into the models and use the models back to kind of check how we're doing with our assumptions. To go back now, after that kind of general introduction for some of the main things, for Whitlock's studies, this was at higher elevation places, a long ways from the village, up in the high country. There's several different lakes that she looked at, and the main thing I want you to look at this one and think about is that when they cross-reference the fire scars from the different trees with the charcoal, essentially you get kind of this periodicity or years in which fires happen. Sometimes those sync up. Sometimes there's one place, 10 kilometers away will show a fire, and for the same year, the next place won't. And so there's a lot of different variability, and a lot of times we don't see a direct climate signal. And so how do we interpret that? Bryle's work from Bowling Lake there on the Siskiyou Crest between kind of like Cave Junction and Happy Camp area. One of the things I like with her work is that she showed this little model of kind of the edge of the elevational zones for the vegetation. So we have like the oak woodlands, mixed evergreen, conifer zone here, and then going up. Well, one of the things to think about, if you have the village here and you have a trail going up to this high country, and this is like where her lake level is at, how much of that is a lightning influence versus the anthropogenic influence? And in some other work that I've been working with Becky Estes and Carl Skinner and Eric Knapp and Jay Miller and those looking at fire severity patterns, we know for the Klamath that there's this effective inversion. And that's roughly around 4,000 foot, and you generally see higher variability in higher intensity patches above the inversion that affect landscape fire patterns, and then generally below the inversion. It wasn't until I was looking at, and I needed to find a quote, but I won't add it here, looking at the Rogue River, some early fire lookout historical documents said, oh, after a big lightning strike came through, the fire suppression forces and the crews are so busy trying to put out those spot fires that the Indians from Agnes are out burning under the cover of the inversion. And I thought, oh, that's pretty sly. And so, sometimes we think, well, yeah, lightning, Zeus came along and ignited all these things on the ridges. In the case of that's Creator or God's doing their role above this area. But then how might important if the lightning doesn't reach down in this elevation based on what we see for the distribution of lightning, what kind of aboriginal burning strategies do we need to have to still maintain that diversity to meet our cultural functions and needs? So, in order to address this at my local level based on those other former paleoclimate studies that have been done often at higher elevations, I teamed up with University of Nevada, Reno, Jeff Crawford and Scott Mensing. This is Jeff's graduate work, and essentially looking at two lower elevation lakes. Some of his questions were, does past vegetation composition and fire currents change in a manner inconsistent with regional climate reconstructions? So kind of that climate question. And then, is the timing of landscape level change consistent with archaeological evidence for Native American occupation across the region? So we really had to kind of try to bring those two things together. And so here's our sites. Back again to the other map. Here's Lake Aramtak, our frog pond, Somes Bar. These are the green villages, the Creek villages. There's Orleans. I live up in this area. Here's Fish Lake, another site. This is the Yurok tribal territory here. This is the Karuk territory here. This is the Bluff Creek village, which was Yurok and Karuk. Little trail goes up through that way. My hazel plots were down in this area at Cooper Ranch. And then I's village for the Karuk is right there on that flat, and there was a trail that came right up through here and connected to that lake. So these are pretty close to the river. I mean, something you could walk up to and back in a day easily. So I'm not going to get into the methods too much because I think their next speaker is going to cover them, but basically in order to core these lakes, had a little raft pontoon thing, went out there, took the piston core. Jeff and Scott were back in the lab, essentially breaking it down by centimeter increments, filtering out the charcoal, doing the pollen count, and reconstructing at least the charcoal fire frequency and the vegetation around there. The funner part I like doing, which is a little bit more kind of gnarly, but in order for us to reconstruct what the fire history was and to cross-reference that with the charcoal data, I hooked up with the Yukonom hotshot crews, and we went out. Often we had to find these big down fir. Sometimes you don't even see a cat face, or you don't even see the fire cavity on them, so there's kind of a hidden fire scar. But when you get in there and look, sure enough, there she burned right there back in that date. Well, whatever that is, you got to pack it back down, get it to the lab, and have it sanded up. And then, it's a very labor-intensive process. And one of the problems, I think, with my project is having an adequate sample size. A lot of the earlier harvest units in here, the stumps are decomposed. There's fewer pines. Can't use hardwood. So to find the data you need, you got to work in our Klamath country, not to mention packing that 3-foot bar saw around and then having these other guys try to help you when you can. It helps out, but it's a lot of work to try to get that other point local data. Another study that was done just to the north of us by Carl Skinner, and this is basically fire years from 1729 all the way down to 1903, which was the last fire at that site. That area came up with a mean fire return interval of 8 years. Here's Enam Village. This is the salmon medicine making area for the Karuk. There's a trail that comes right up through here, and there's that place. This is an unpublished study by Carl, but when we look at the seasonality of the fires, there's a majority late summer or early fall, which is a late wood. 14% were early or late early wood, and 10%. So you can break down and look at the seasonality of that. And so often if you're getting some of this, like 10 to 15% of this non-lightning signature fires recording on the ring boundary, is that anthropogenic, or does that just happen to be an earlier, drier year? We don't know, but sometimes, you know, you have to kind of bring in this other information to help you at least address that. Back at our site for Lake Armstrong, just to the south of the ones for Carl's study, so far out of based on 11 fire scar samples. We have pretty good correlation between the charcoal and the years there. We have a mean fire return interval of 11 years. 90% of the fires are late or dormant season. And there's also evidence of very light fires. We see, you know, sometimes trees based on the distance from the pith, trees less than 4 inches in diameter scarring. And so that has to be a very frequent fire regime in there. Also, too, this place, it has a serpentine outbreak on one side, changes to a red clay soil type, and it also has like a different kind of convergent soil type. So really, around the small lake basin, there's also a lot of substrate and other, you know, vegetation diversity around it. When Jeff began to look at the fire scar comparison with his charcoal peaks, again, here's just another way of looking at that correlation. Some years it matches up and you get pretty good certainty. Other years it's a little bit offset. But essentially we're using the two different methods to calibrate that. Looking at this part of it, you have kind of the fire exclusion signature as we go from the far distant past to more of the recent. So we do see a change there for related to suppression. And this one other part was a prescribed burn in 1997 that helps us calibrate at least what we were seeing. Now, another element, that Fish Lake, that other southern site, we're still working on the data there. I can tell you Portford cedars are really hard, even though they're 600 to 700 years old. It's very tough to look at those little tight rings. But between those two sites, just to leave you with this, is that Fish Lake apparently looks like it has more of a potentially anthropogenic signature, less climate, whereas the Frog Pond or Lake Armstrong has more of a climatic signature when it compared to other paleoclimate studies around that area. And so again, these are two low elevation lakes near villages, but we're seeing basically a different kind of fire characteristic for those. In order to infer the archaeological part, we had to go just kind of to the southwest or to the northwest, both on Smith River and Redwood Creek, to look at other archaeological information there. Just to kind of touch base on that, this is this sweat house there from that place. The nearest archaeological stuff is up on the hill, and then our lake was just really just across the Klamath River over in this area. So, you know, not too far as the crow flies across the river drainage. So we're trying to look at other regional archaeological information to help inform us. Oh, Jeff, whoops. Sorry, borrowed this slide from Jeff. There we go. So essentially on this one, what we're seeing is 0 years before present and going back longer is that we do see this effect of the medial climatic anomaly from 1100 to 700 years before present, and then the effect of the little ice age. The part that we learned from archaeological information is that there's this Gunther pattern here around 1500 years before present. We see regional technological changes, populations begin to settle down along the river, increase in salmon production and fisheries, and early sedentism going on that time point. And then we see another wave of migration, the Athabascan groups coming down into California. And so when we begin to kind of look at climate and also culture, there are some of these things that are happening temporally, but also sometimes spatially they're slightly off because different tribal groups are coming and residing, and there's demographic shifts going on there. And so how do we tease out even those within tribal variation when we also have this gradient from kind of moister coastal to interior? So that's confounding our results and how we're going to interpret things a little bit. Now I want to talk, we need to wrap things up here, but talk a little bit about the methods of TEK in the GIS. Rely a lot on ethnographic information, those interviews, field notes, historical maps and photographs. Have to go in and digitize. This is a 1928 map showing all these little trails from Hoopaw Valley all the way up towards Happy Camp. Have had a GIS person help me digitize those in. I want to look at an analysis of comparison for different types of data, bring those together. This optimal foraging theory and fire use hasn't quite been brought together, but if you're looking at villages and how far people actually would go to optimal habitats, that might also be tied to fire land use patterns. And then thinking about the applications for restoration, conservation, and sustainable management. One such study that I would like to replicate in the Klamath is this guy's Morgan's work from the Sierra Nevada. Essentially, he looked at kind of campsites. He looked at the villages, looked at these trails, and he found essentially that there was an optimal distance where you would travel in one day and you got too far out, and then there was an optimal distance to the campsite, which was kind of the overnight trip. And he did this based on bedrock mortars and acorn caches. And I think that there's something to be said here, because this also gets at the elevational difference as well as distance from the village. And I think these kind of archaeological models might help us understand those human land use practices. Another way of looking at that is John Stewart and Lisa Salazar had their fire history studies done here. It happens to be this part on the map. Here's this place called Cedar Camp, which is these two places right there, as well as this old trail goes right along where their fire history studies are. And in their study, they say, many fires, therefore, were probably ignited by Native Americans, burning to culture basket materials, food, and clothing. On the Orleans Ranger District, the mean fire return intervals ranged from 21 to 86 years. The overall mean was 36 years. So if we just looked at their data, we would think, wow, that's 36 years as a mean is pretty long. That's probably more of a climatic. But yet when we look at the other studies that were done just up in this area and a little bit farther down where ours, we're looking anywhere between 8 to 11 years. That could be a distance of where it's at from the village, or it could also be just the sampling resolution in which they are doing that. But when you look at the archaeological or heritage files for the same area, a Karuk man in 1983 said a trail used to run from Big Bar along a ridge to Cedar Camp and then to Elk Valley. Here's up Elk Valley right there, so it's talking about coming down through this area. And then another Karuk woman said brush was burned in Cedar Camp and Cedar Creek area to bring back the deer. So we see more of a hunting strategy for this one. Well, sometimes we have great ethnographic information that talks about the burning in one place, but we don't have the fire history study or the paleoclimate stuff to go with it. And so on one side of the river on this ridge, we might have this ethnographic stuff. On this other side of the river and over here, we might have a different set of data. And so at what scale can I really infer from one side of the river to the next? And that really hasn't been discussed in the literature, but I want to kind of push that issue and have you think about it, because just because they burned on one area might necessarily mean that they were doing it in another. And then you have to look at the kind of topographic as well as the substrate diversity. I see a lot of differences between substrate changes between serpentine and the red clay and shale schist for the cultural use products of the vegetation that's found on those different communities. But for this other area across the river, and I'll show you a photograph for this one, Chimney Ridge went up the side of the east, ridge east of Deer Lick Saddle. The trail was used to get there. It was also used to drive stock or cattle to the pastures on the south side of Chimney Ridge. This was originally open grassland, which was maintained by Indian burning. Over hundreds and thousands of years of burning had created open grassland for deer and elk forage. When the whites came, it was used as pasturage at certain times of the year. So this is up to kind of like pre-fire suppression, so up to about the 1920s. Now it's been grown over with many oaks, madrones, conifers, and the south sides of many ridges in this area were also used. So when we look at the fire history studies and they say, well, the upper third slope position burns a little bit more hotter and intensely, we see a more frequent fire regime there. Some of the ethnographic stuff also talks about that topographic diversity for certain places. And so if we use Wieslander's 1930 vegetation studies, this is that trail coming through up to this place that Deer Lick Saddle came across. I'll show you that in the next aerial photograph. And it connected to this place, which is essentially that next campsite out. So a little bit too far to walk in one day, but definitely worth going and spending the night, foraging, doing whatever you're going to do, and then maybe come back to the village the next night. And so continuing on, cattle on the Salmon Summit Trail, his family would hunt primarily deer and some bear at LeParron Flat. That's where the star's at. He had walked many of the trails. One trail had followed Rattlesnake Ridge. And then these were used as pack trails. The Forest Service maintained and improved these existing trails. And packers often improved the Indian trails. So that area I was talking about, here's Deer Lick. It comes along this area through that Serpentine Homestead. Here's Trail Creek up to LeParron Flat. That's how it looked more or less in 1944 with the first road coming in. And then here's the same place more or less in 2003. And you see the little bit of the shrinkage on the meadow there. You definitely see a change in southwest aspect to a little bit change here with now that old clear-cut brush patch in there and a road coming down through there. And so we see some landscape change, and part of it's forest management, part of it's also exclusion. It's interesting when you look at the same notes, often those Indian trails turn into pack trails, or the places when the CCC, the California Conservation Corps, during the Depression era, those were the easiest places they could get up with a pack mule to put the fires out. So the most frequently indigenous burn places, or that were also being burned by whites who often married Indian women running cattle or hunting, those were then the most easiest places that fire suppression was the most effective. It's easier to put out a fire in a grassland rather than way down in the bottom of the hole in some old growth. And so they're often able to catch these on the ridge, but we saw that factor then really shifting from an aboriginal fire regime to more successful fire exclusion and suppression. So when we think about the additional research needs, again, coming back to this landscape model, we need to compare historical and ethnographic information with the fire history studies. I want to do that. I'm kind of working that way right now. Compare site-specific archaeological and tribal land use information with the paleoclimate, see whether they're applicable at which scale, and then compare the fire history sample points as individual sample points of scars as a distance factor from historical trail. You know, some of these things, we have a GPS mark right on the stump, you know, and some are down bottom of the hole by the riparian, some are up by the ridge. Is there a gradient? Do we see more frequent fires on those individual trees closer to the ridge versus those ones farther down in the hole? And then to kind of leave you with this and have you think about this part of it, there was a study done back east where essentially they looked at General Land Office survey maps, had the vegetation distribution, the site record trees, and then Bean and Sanderson essentially used the far site model, and they said, well, for grassland, savanna, a different forest type, a close forest, what does it say there? Savanna at 100 years, and then a savanna at 30 years, 100 years, and then the forest. If essentially they did the ignition and said, well, if we apply this ignition frequency, what's going to give us the vegetation that we saw in historical records? And after they modeled this, essentially they showed it's not the lightning. You have to basically burn it at this frequency to get the historical condition that was more grassland and savannas. And so they had an interesting study there that I think is applicable to things out here in the West. And then as far as looking at data sources and restoration, you know, there's applicable scientific methods. What is available? It can help fire ecologists and managers with looking at the historical application of fire in the land, frequencies, intensity, and the application of fire in different habitats for different ecosystem services or processes. And then it also provides us an alternative for additional information by incorporating those in. And I always like to use this photograph because if you talk to this Klamath Indian about why they were burning huckleberries and managing for elk, it might be a lot more different what he says than the fire scars there that you would get from that pine stump. Some other things to think about it in a contemporary context, we do see climate influences at both regional and watershed level processes, whether it's kind of a moderated fire year or a bad fire year, so to speak. Tribal cultures did adapt to these biophysical conditions and resource productivity, so that was that bigger kind of fire regime climate influence. Fire is a major process and influence on biodiversity, and there is different adaptive strategies that tribals are implementing. I was out doing fire behavior assessment team FBAT plots with Joanne Fights on the Soames fire. So this patch right here is right about in there where it burned on that early part of August. But that was an informative way to use plot data and thermocouples and say, well, if this fire backs under kind of a cool, low severity or low intensity, you know, what's the result on this tan oak stand that we found rock mortars and pestles and things in there, so I knew it was an important cultural use site. The importance of trails, they're very similar to roads or how roads are now. These are some of the strategic landscape positions to manage at the watershed or sub-watershed level. Definitely within the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, they talk about the old trails, talk about the emergency access routes, how we're going to break up kind of these fuel sheds across the different areas. Trails have come up both from a historical standpoint and from a tribal interest. Economically, these are more effective areas. You can actually grab out from the road, and so maybe if you treat this area, you have your strategic placed landscape fuel breaks. And then just the tribal quality and conditions versus public uses. Some cases they're sacred sites, so we just have to kind of have mitigation or think about the vulnerability of some of those treatments. Just from a contemporary tribal perspective, there's often areas that show up as more culturally significant habitats. Access there for potential management is important. And then essentially, you know, weavers want to see the burns going on out there. This is a young guy that stayed with Laverne, who I also worked with. This is another year-out guy who's the fire patrol. These ladies are out there gathering the bear grass. And so how do we tie these things together? You know, if we know this place was burned, is that an area that we're going to prioritize for cultural burning, prescribed burning, and can we fit that into our larger landscape fire and fuels management priorities? And that's it.
As you're doing all of this science, which has tremendous sweep to it, how do you convey the lessons you're learning and learn from members of local tribal groups what they might contribute to your studies. What is the way in which that exchange occurs?
Thank you. So do I need to repeat the question? So basically, what's the way in which I interact with the local tribal community, and how does that inform or affect my research interest? So I think I'm a big proponent of community or tribal-based forestry and research. And I think if we're going to look at the best available science that's applicable to a local community, as scientists, we need to go to those local communities and ask them what the researchable questions are. Sometimes, you know, if you hold a community forum, I've seen that come out of like the planning for a Healthy Forest Restoration Act timber sale proposal that the Forest Service had when the Watershed Council and the Fire Safe Council had their public meetings for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. The public there also addressed some concerns. So those are some broad level. And then I think I mentioned that because I think that's more the effective way that researchers from the outside could come in and gain information. And then as a tribal descendant, when I'm out there with my grandpa picking acorns, hunting deer, gathering huckleberries, or out with Laverne, my community forestry fellowship mentor, and the basket weaver I work with, you know, it's like I can kind of ask a researchable question. What is your researchable question, Laverne? It's like, well, you know, it's like you go out there and look, it's like, oh, this looks like there's good hazel shoots. Well, we go through that unit. Oh, all those were thinned as part of the understory thinning for that, you know, emergency road access fuels reduction. Well, what we really need to do is have it burned. Okay, so when do we burn it? Well, you can burn it in the spring or in the fall. Well, which ones are better? Well, I see it different. So then I take that kind of interest question, and then I try to apply and set up a study, and it's like, well, do we manage at the shrub or do we manage at the stand? So I try to gain the local information by being out there in the field with the tribal people, and then it's like, for me, when I'm at the ceremonies and, you know, we're getting ready to go into dance or we're just kind of hanging out at men's camp, I'll say, so what about Frog Pond? And it's like, oh, yeah, there used to be this old trail that went up through there, and sometimes I'll break out my little map and be like, all right, show me where that was at. And it's like, well, how was that serpentine used? Because I've seen this old granite rock up there, and it's serpentine. And it's like, oh, well, there's that big Manzanita patch. Yeah, well, they probably were processing nuts there. Okay. And then, well, what about this over here? And so I try to, you know, both formally through oral history interviews, which went through the institutional review board and having the informed consent, but I also tried to interact with people just at the community level and, you know, and be like, what is a major issue for you? And I know as a social scientist, I think they call it the snowball technique, where you ask one person one thing and see what the common themes come out of it, and ask another. Now, it's interesting, after I thought the Karuk tribe, who's against archaeological excavations, would also have issues about sediment core in these, quote, sacred lakes. And that's actually just the opposite. Now that they're interested in it, even though the data might not necessarily support that ethnographic or cultural signature, they still want to see another place sampled and are looking for someone to work with me to do the charcoal and pollen, because they're like, well, we used to burn on Off-Field Mountain, which is our most sacred mountain near the center of our world village, Kadameen, and we want to reconstruct the fire history there because we want to show the interplay of what we knew was our burning regime with what's considered the natural regime and help science inform us. And so I think there's a turn in tribal communities where they don't see researchers necessarily just coming in and grabbing information and kind of profiting or elevating themselves academically off of it, but rather coming in, and when you ask what are your researchable questions, then they can help you with what those researchable questions are, sampling design, areas that they would prefer maybe you to look at, and then you can kind of work in your science. Well, we have to have a few different sites for replication, or we have to do this, and they're patient with that. But you got to kind of have to go to the community to address that question. Sorry, a little long-winded, but.
Frank, is this information of the elders, is that being recorded for the tribe? That type of information? Because I know that I've spoken to elders and for my own information, but I think that a lot of it is lost if I don't put it down, or somehow it's not being preserved.
Yeah. So the question is, how is this tribal information being recorded and documented from elders in the community? Well, I know the tribe had cultural anthropologists come in and do some interviews, and that was part of a paper and report that went to the local national forest. I also see, through a different way, the language programs where they have mentor and youth. Those capture a lot of the language, but focus also on some resource management things, so they'll focus on fisheries or basketry as part of the language topic. And then there's also been some great work done with the elementary school with videography work, where the elementary school students have gone and interviewed elders, and you get a lot of rich family history out of that. And then what happens is that the elementary school students, like 5th to 8th grade in that area, interviewed different family members, and then they helped basically take all that film, work it down in topic areas, and then they made like 30-minute or 15-minute presentations, and then that was a community viewing. And so it's being captured that way. There's also cultural camps, and just this is my own little thing, because I see us moving from a way of life in many tribal communities, and this has come up across many people I've talked about TEK, is we see more and more a tribal preservation approach, where it's like we have a 1-week culture camp, we might have 2 ceremonies in the summertime, and then what's going on the rest of the time of the year. You know, if we're just going to live Indian for, essentially 5 days in that cultural camp and 3 or 4 days on those other few key weekends, what happens during the rest of the year? And for me, I'm a very strong proponent is you live it every day, every week, seasonally, what's available, and you make the effort to go look and see what's happening. You gather something, even if it's small, because when you gather even just a few little geophytes or lilies and Indian potatoes and you bring them back to an elder, oh yeah, and then what was going on? Well, I saw this many deer browse, this was the size of this deer track, and this is what's going on here. Oh, here's some basket sticks from this area. And so I think as you make the effort, then that helps the elders want to talk and share more with you. And so some of that I think is happening more in a traditional sense, where it's happening within the family, within community, and interpersonal relationships that isn't so much being recorded and available on a shelf where you can search by keyword, but something that's within our heart and within our everyday of who we are. And I think that's where it's really going to last. But you got to work at it, When you talk about lamprey eels or other things, if the population is so depressed, how many people are really going out there to try to collect resources if it's access issues or degraded habitat or pollution or urbanization. And so all those other factors compound the maintenance and retention of that knowledge. And so, but you got to work at it. I mean, even if it's just a few, just to keep that knowledge living. And I also see, too, gender differences kind of being overcome, where it used to be kind of women's stuff and men's stuff. Why am I interested in women's foods? Well, because no one's had a pit oven and harvested these lilies, and they're tied to oak, ecotones and prairie habitat. So for me as a fire and fuel scientist, to bring it back to the culture where it means the most, you girls got to be out there with your digging sticks and get on it, and then we could talk about setting up a prescribed fire and doing, like one of the forests has a river to ridges oak woodland restoration proposal, and bring that in at various scales, and that way we maintain it within the community. Well, thank you much.